BRICS are taking a stand. They haven't been happy at the bottom of the world order for years, and now with Trump throwing his weight around, chucking tariffs out and threatening almost every country in the world, the BRICS nations and their alliance is putting together a plan. They're actually working together for the first time for real ever. They are negotiating, plotting, and scheming behind America's back, and the consequences of all of this will be monstrous. No one really knows where this is going to go exactly next, but you best know exactly what is happening right now, or it will cost you. In this video, I'm going to do my best to explain everything you could possibly need to know to make sure you are prepared for what's coming next and you're not blocked or blinded out by the propaganda spewed by the mainstream media. And of course, it isn't just America or Americans who this concerns. The plan that BRICS nations are putting together has all of us in the crosshairs, from the UK and Canada to France and Germany and Australia. The simple fact is that if you live in the West in a developed country, this is going to impact your country's economy and likely your investments and financial stability as well. And so if you want to protect yourself and your family, perhaps building an online income is the way to go. And so if you want to protect yourself and your family and your futures, my honest to God advice for anyone wanting to do that is to build an online independent income. Now, I'm going to be running a free class showing you exactly how to do that, how to build an online income up to $3,000 per month from scratch with no experience. There's only 100 spaces available for this free class, and it's done on a first come, first served basis. And you can see when it is and register and save your spot by clicking the link down below in your description now. But back to the video, and what actually is BRICS? Well, what most people don't understand is how this organization was founded in the first place. The truth is that it wasn't created by Brazil or Russia or India or China or South Africa at all. It was created in the early 2000s by a banker at Goldman Sachs. And his idea was actually really simple. These are emerging economies that had a lot of similarities with each other. They had large populations, low GDP per capita, but they were growing at a fast rate in the early 2000s. And lots of natural resources. And they had a lot of new opportunities to invest in, but investors were terrified of putting their money in these countries because there was no stability or perceived, success in investing in these emerging countries. And so this banker at Goldman Sachs invented the term BRICS as basically a marketing term to sell securities and IPOs and stocks and resources and shares to investors from these countries, all so that Goldman Sachs could make money. The BRICS idea then became famous and it started to get recognized around the world until it was that worldly recognized term as it is today. In 2009, the BRICS nations, the actual countries which were described in this BRICS idea, put together their first BRICS summit, and it became an actual organization which was still very loose and didn't really do much, but it was at least real. Now, BRICS nations spoke about a lot of different things, the ideas of creating new financial systems and cooperating with each other in regards to trade and all sorts of things, but they really didn't do anything for the best part of 20 years since their existence started. You see, in the 2010s, when relations between East and West, or North and South, were much better than they are today, there was no real incentive for these BRICS nations to bother taking it seriously, and then 2020 came around, and suddenly tensions got far worse, and so they actually started cooperating. Now, the two big things that caused this massive change were COVID and COVID lockdowns, and then the Ukraine war as well. Now, COVID being so closely related to China changed public perception for China for Western citizens all over the world, and that public perception is then reflected in the foreign policy of our governments. There's far more scrutiny applied to China, to the concentration camps they have of Uyghur Muslims right now, to their economic problems, their housing bubble that's collapsing, and their threatened invasion of Taiwan. We're getting far more critical coverage of all of these things that China is doing, rightly so I should say, in the legacy media, which we never used to get before COVID. And then, of course, we have Russia's invasion of Ukraine as well, which caused that instant, direct tirade of responses from the West against Russia, those sanctions on individuals, those boycotts of Russian gas and oil, the arms sent to Ukraine, the military and diplomatic support for Ukraine as well. And what we really see is over the last few years, these BRICS countries have gotten serious and they've started to actually try and work together as more of an alliance than they were before. And and they're now growing in size as well. Here's a headline that worries and shocks a lot of people. BRICS expands with new partner countries. Now it's half of the global population and 41% of the global economy. And you can see this diagram here showing people who are already a member in red, their supposed partners, which are like partial members of BRICS in orange, people who have been invited in the other colors as there. And then other countries which have been invited into the organization as well. And last year, we saw this first big expansion of BRICS with a bunch of new countries joining, in particular, a few Arab Gulf states like Iran and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Then there's these generic middle ground countries which aren't super closely aligned with the West anymore, countries like Egypt and Ethiopia and Iran that you can see here. There are some more countries which have expressed interests in joining, but it's not yet clear if they're actually going to. And then, of course, there are the partner states like Kazakhstan and Belarus over here, which are partial members essentially. Now again, BRICS literally started out as a marketing term created by a banker to sell really bad, risky stocks and securities to investors from undesirable countries, and it's now evolved into a loose cooperative which pretty much only exists to oppose American hegemony. Now the three big players, the actual important countries when it comes to BRICS, are Russia, India, and China. Sure, BRICS itself stands literally for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but Brazil and South Africa are really not key players on the geopolitical stage. In fact, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Iran are far more important than South Africa or Brazil are at this point. And in essence, what we're seeing here is all of these countries have just been facing pressure and poor tensions with the United States in recent years. And so they're all now cooperating with each other to try and protect themselves against the United States, to damage the United States, to make it weaker and poorer, and to make themselves richer and safer in comparison. Now that's at the end of the day why this is such an important topic to cover now in 2025, because BRICS are now finally starting to work together. They're not just putting out these random nonsense press releases like they used to, and for decades the animosity between BRICS themselves stopped it from being an important player, but in recent times that animosity has been disappearing and it's getting replaced by these desires for strengthened security and peace between each of them. India and China, for example, two of probably the most important countries of BRICS, have basically been at each other's throats for literally decades, and the idea of them being in an alliance together was laughable. They've had incredibly poor relations. They've had a disputed border high up in the mountains, in the Himalayan mountains, for literally decades. They've fought border skirmishes and even a war in the 60s, the Sino-Indian War between soldiers. Men literally died fighting each other, and it's been continuing going on and on. In 1962, 300 soldiers on both sides were killed. In 1967, about 1,000 soldiers were killed, all the way up into 2020, when 30 soldiers died on each side in a clash using purely knives and spears, because India and China have this really weird agreement where they basically say, we're going to keep disputing this border and arguing over who owns it, and we're going to keep sending our soldiers there to sort of just plant flags and get in the way, but we're not going to shoot each other. We're just going to stab each other with swords and spears instead. Very weird. Of course, China and Pakistan are also very close allies, and they work together to help each other grow economically. And India and Pakistan hate each other deeply. And so India has always severely resented China's support for Pakistan and tried to isolate Pakistan to little success. And at the end of the day, China and India are by far and away the two most population-dense nations in the world. They're both still very poor per capita. Even China, most people think China's a middle-income country, but it really isn't. And India is still incredibly poor. And they see each other as a threat, as they're the only other countries that can match their manpower pools and their reserves and the potential scale of their economies. And so in these evolving economies where they're using their massive population to their advantage, they both kind of feel like only one can come out on top, so they've always worked against each other and actively been enemies most of the time. Now, China and Russia actually have a similar dynamic. Russia was the key power behind the USSR and worldwide communism, and today Russia sees itself, especially under Putin, as the spiritual successor to the USSR. And communist China, of course, used to be firmly under the USSR's sphere of influence. China was incredibly dependent on the USSR for military equipment, for technology, for experienced labor, and so on. But in the 60s, China and the USSR started to pull away from each other. The Soviets removed all of their military and industrial advisors from China. They ended most of their joint projects together, and China gets stuck in the Sino-Indian War and doesn't get any support from the Soviet Union and essentially feels betrayed. And so both of these governments start to publicly criticize each other and publicly criticize each other's versions of communism. Now, eventually in the 90s, relations started to get better again, but Russia is the older partner, the more senior partner, and wants to be in charge, whilst China is far richer, far more technologically advanced, and just far larger and more powerful today. And that leads to situations like this one right here, where a leaked FSB report, which is basically like Russia's FBI, announces that they're actually scared and worried of China, in particular worried that China could seize territory if there were a European war. And they're talking about Russian territory there. Of course, China's only really going to get more powerful in comparison to Russia in the future, so Russia is constantly feeling threatened by the size and the might and the population of China, and China is desperate to prove that it ought to be that senior partner in any relationship. It's actually very, very similar to what happened with the United Kingdom and the United States in the first half of the 20th century. In the first half, the UK was far more wealthy with more military might and political influence. By the 1950s, it had completely switched around. The USA was 5 times bigger, 5 times more populous, 5 times richer, more powerful in pretty much every way. And so India, Russia, and China, and BRICS as a whole, really actually truly working together has always been difficult and a little bit of a tin pot theory, because they all want to be the senior party and they will never really be allies, right? The Germans and the Austrians, they're real allies. Their governments and their people genuinely want the best for the other country. The UK and Canada, again, they're real allies. The governments and the people, they genuinely want the best for each other. Russia, India, and China don't like each other. The governments don't like each other and the people don't like each other, and they'll only work together to further their own aims. And if they could screw the other one over and get away with it without harming themselves, they would do it in an instance. But alone, none of these countries have the influence or the power to oppose US hegemony, and that's what's made BRICS pretty irrelevant for the first 20 years of its existence, and that's why it's changing now. Right? The ego and the contempt between these countries like India, Russia, and China has in the past worked incredibly well for the West. We never really had to worry about competing against a united opposition because these countries were just as concerned about each other as they were with us. But that is now changing as they're starting to realize that the West is a far bigger threat, a far more active threat to them than they realized before. And so they've created this plot and this scheme to hurt us and to try and save them. And I do want to make this really quick point here that actually we are all at threat from this. If you have a pension or stocks or even savings or a job, this will impact you. Our investments are all global, right? Either you're outside the US and you're investing into American stocks because they just dominate the global market, or you're inside the US investing into American stocks that actually operate all around the world, that make a huge amount of their money from Europe or Asia as well. And so when America gets targeted, or when American companies suffer, or when the US dollar's hegemony gets attacked, all of our pensions lose money, our jobs stop paying so well, our stocks go down, our savings are more likely to be raided by the tax man. And so all of us really should be watching this, no matter what country we're from, and thinking about how we can protect ourselves from these problems as they arise. And I do genuinely want to help you prepare for these problems before they ever become problems for you, which is why I've put together, and I'm going to be running a free class very soon teaching you how to build a $3,000 a month online side hustle from scratch today, using the exact same method that I used to do that originally, and that I've helped literally dozens of other people use to do it as well. The class is 100% free. I've spent the last month putting this class together, spending literally dozens and dozens of hours on it with myself and my team involved as well. And in it, I'll show absolutely anyone, yourself included, how you can use this new system that my team and I have built to build an online income up to $3,000 a month guaranteed without needing to have done anything like this before. Now, there are limited spaces available for this free class. There's only 100 of those spaces. The last time we ran one of these, those spaces filled out the first day we announced it. So click that link down below in the description to save your space. It will also tell you what time the class is actually happening on your time zone, because of course it will vary. And again, it's free, and I'll show you everything that you need to know to build that online passive income, and we'll have some fun as we do it as well. Now back to BRICS, and unfortunately they are now actually really working together for the first time ever. So why has this happened? What's been the catalyst to create this changing dynamic? Well, two key reasons: Russia's invasion of Ukraine and really the West's response to that. And then number two is Trump's trade wars and generic American attacks on other countries. So China and India, they don't really care about Ukraine or the Russian invasion. If Russia wins or loses, they really don't care. It doesn't affect them much at all. But they do care about their ability to exert force when they want to, and they care about the West and the United States potentially opposing them exerting that force, as they have done in Ukraine against Russia so far. And that's what we see, right? Russia invaded Ukraine. The West put sanctions on high-ranking Russians. They blocked Russia's export of oil and gas and tried to strangle their economy. They actively sent military equipment, very advanced equipment, to Ukraine. And they're using diplomacy to try and stop the Russian invasion of Ukraine. China and India don't care about that happening in Ukraine. But they do care that if they want to do what Russia did, perhaps with India in Kashmir or with China in Taiwan, they're scared that the West might oppose them too. China really, really wants to control Taiwan. India really, really wants to control Kashmir. And so China and India are supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine because China might want to invade Taiwan in the near future, and India might want to do the same to Kashmir. And they will want to incentivize the West away from opposing them. And they'd also like to incentivize other BRICS nations into helping them should they do it as well. Now, the other key reason for these closer BRICS cooperation is Trump's trade wars, right? He is actively attacking and harming their economies with their tariffs. He's openly stating what the aims of these tariffs and these measures are, and this is actively weakening BRICS economies and reducing their exports. It's making it harder to manufacture in BRICS countries. It's making these BRICS nations economically weaker. China, Russia, and India obviously don't like this, so they're working together to try and inflict a little bit of pain back on the United States and to stop them being damaged or targeted. But of course, it's just not just tariffs, of course, right? I've lumped most of Trump's foreign policy into that space in general because it all comes down to that same aim. But another example is, of course, the brand new news we've seen over the last week of changes to the American H-1B visa rules, so they now cost $100,000 a piece to get one of these supposedly high income, specially skilled employment visas. Now, this will hurt China and India a lot because there are literally millions of H-1B immigrants going into the United States every single year, making a lot of money with high paying jobs, and then sending that money back home to their families, their old countries, in remittances. And India alone makes more than $200 billion a year from remittances. So headlines like this, Modi will pay a price for H-1B visa curbs, are 100% true. Of course, the US has been attacking China's tech industry in particular. They basically locked China out of the most advanced microchips in the world, to the point where these Chinese phones, which used to be really technologically advanced, they haven't improved in 3 years. They've got the exact same performance as they had 3 years ago, the exact same battery technology and chip technology, because they just can't get a handle on the good stuff that the West is producing. Now, this actually started with Biden back in 2022, but has obviously been continued by Trump over the last year, and it has massively hurt China's tech industry and their military industry. They're basically just competing with 3-year-old hardware, and it's only going to get worse. They're never really going to be able to advance past 2022's level of technology, and they'll never be advanced as the United States is. So on the whole, it's actually quite obvious why BRICS is now seeming as this serious entity, because the US has been actively targeting them for the first time since really the end of the Cold War. Now, what are BRICS plans? What has recently been exposed, and how are they actually helping each other? Well, the first way they're helping each other is just outright economic cooperation. Now, Russia's is the obvious example here, right? They produce a huge amounts of oil and natural gas and coal and just all fossil fuels in general. And you can see that they have not been exporting nearly as much as they used to back before that invasion of Ukraine. Here's a graph showing fossil fuel export revenue from Russia over the last few years. Just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, they were doing about 1,000 million euros per day, or about 1 billion euros, peaking at 1.2 billion euros with a very healthy split. A lot of people have this weird misconception about Russia's economy that it's all natural gas. And yes, natural gas is a substantial proportion of their fossil fuel exports, but actually oil and coal is a very, very large aspect of it as well. And as we can see, there's a very, very clear, distinct downward trend in the amount, the value, the money that Russia is getting from these exports of fossil fuels, currently sitting at about 600 million euros per day, whereas it used to be 1,200 million euros per day, about 1.2 billion. This is about 220 billion euros a year. They're making from this $250 billion, circa that number. It used to be literally twice that, around $500 billion a year. Now, the money from these exports is absolutely essential to funding Russia's war in Ukraine. And so this is a big, big hit for Russia and something they have been trying to minimize as much as possible. And these are the results after the cooperation with all these BRICS nations. So obviously these sanctions came in from the West, and it basically removed Russia's previous largest importers of fossil fuels like Germany. And so Russia had to find other countries to sell to, but most countries around the world legally weren't allowed to buy it anymore. And so India and China started to buy up huge amounts of Russian fossil fuels. Now this helps Russia for obvious reasons. They make money selling these products, these commodities that they weren't really able to sell before. But it also helps India and China because the export market for Russian fossil fuels is heavily limited by these global sanctions. That means essentially the demand for these commodities is far lower than it would be on the open market, and so the price that Russia is able to charge is far lower than market rates. So India and China are actually getting a massive discount on oil and gas as well, and Russia is getting the money that it desperately needs to fund its war machines. In fact, one of the reasons that India has been targeted by Trump so heavily, in particular with tariffs, is because they've been importing so much Russian oil. In fact, Trump actively came out and said it. He threatened tariffs of 50% on India if they didn't stop buying so much oil in July. And India basically called them out on their bluff. And then they found out it wasn't a bluff, as in August, Trump then came out and actually put into place that 50% tariff specifically because India was buying Russian oil. Now, I personally believe it's incredibly likely that Trump's changes to the H-1B visas, which will be hurting India far more than any other country in the world, is partially in due a reaction to this Russian oil imports as well. Now, BRICS nations have announced the potential of a joint currency to try and attack and dethrone the US dollar, right? For the last century or so, pretty much, all international fossil fuel trade has been done in the US dollar. Deals are negotiated in US dollars, prices are kept stable in US dollars, and final transactions are made in US dollars as well. And so the status of the dollar as this petrodollar is incredibly valuable to the US. It creates this artificial demand for US dollars. It allows the US to print more money than any other country with far lower inflationary effects. And it also gives America huge amounts of leverage over other countries as they can cut off access to the US dollar and the US dollar-based financial system really, really easily. And so recently, countries like India, Saudi Arabia, and China have been using different currencies for international trade to try and limit their reliance on the US dollar and to damage the US dollar's value. Now, last year, BRICS came out and went one step further and announced that they are going to be looking at and trying to create a potential shared currency for international trade for BRICS nations. Now, the details are still a little bit shaky. We're not 100% sure what it's going to look like. And in fairness, again, there's currently no evidence of the proposal being acted upon or actually built upon by any of these parties. But the general idea is that these BRICS nations have huge natural resource pools, and fiat currencies currently aren't backed by anything, which means they're massively prone to inflationary pressures, which makes them pretty weak currencies often enough. And so BRICS want to create a joint shared currency which would be backed up by the natural resources of each of these BRICS nations that would supposedly be stable enough for international trade and protected against inflation because it would be tied to the value of natural resources, much like the gold standards were. Finally then, we've also seen a load of evidence emerge very recently in particular of direct cooperation between Xi Jinping himself and Indian officials. Essentially, this big news piece broke last week, and it states that Xi handwrote a letter and he sent it to an Indian official who's mostly a figurehead but still very, very big and influential called Murmu. Now, in the letter, Xi expressed massive amounts of concerns about trade deals with the United States that would hurt India and China's interests, and he basically made the argument that tense relations and border disputes between China and India aren't necessary. Neither of them actually need to carry out these tight tensions with each other, and they're hurting both of them by making them isolated on the world stage when coming up against America. She stated that the greater threat posed to both India and China was the United States and Trump, and that they should really both start working together, improving relations with each other, coordinating together. Now, this letter was actually first sent months and months ago after Trump first announced his tariffs, but it's only recently been exposed and leaked and now reported on in the media. But we've already been seeing improvements in relations between the two countries almost immediately, right? There have been lots of high-ranking Indian and Chinese officials starting to visit each other, go on, national state tours and to work with each other very deeply. And China has now even come up with a new phrase to describe this alliance that they're building, and they're using it constantly. They call it the dragon elephant dance, or the dragon elephant tango, much like that UK and US special relationship that prime ministers love to go on and on about. Now, if this trend continues and Russia and China and India continue to work together, if they get closer, they get past these old obstacles and they grow, and they even get other BRICS nations like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Iran to work together as well, that could spell disaster for the US dollar and the US economy and the West as a whole, right? If the US dollar were to lose its petrodollar status or its status as world reserve currency, that would be disastrous, and it would cause essentially a massive debt crisis in America. There'd be a massive rise in the cost of US debt, and it would potentially bankrupt the US government altogether. Military cooperation between these countries for invasions, like we've seen with Russia and Ukraine as well, is a massive threat. That would make it far, far harder for the United States, for the West and NATO to oppose those invasions, and that would lead to more conflict. Now, this growing influence of BRICS and the lesser influence and the lesser power of the West and NATO is a serious threat here. And again, I get how easy it is to sort of push these ideas away and just bury your head in the sand. But the truth is, we're all susceptible to these economic impacts of this grand BRICS alliance, no matter where we live, if it's the States or Canada or the UK or Europe, or even countries on the other side of the world like Australia. Again, if you want to make sure you're protected, that your income isn't tied to tariffs placed on your country or mass layoffs from a billion-dollar corporation, the only real way to do that is to control your own earnings, which is exactly what I've spent the last 5 years of my life working out how to do that. So if you want to learn how I did it for myself and how I've helped dozens of other people do it as well, without needing any experience, without having ever needed to make a single cent online before, without ever making a video like this on social media or a YouTube video, or ever even having to put your name or your face out onto the internet, then come to my free class that I'm running, where I show you exactly step by step how to build an online income up to $3,000 a month guaranteed. The class that I'm running, it's 100% free. I've spent countless hours over the last month putting it together, making sure that it's packed with value. And of course, if you want to hear about financial, economic, and geopolitical news before everyone else, then you can also sign up for my free email newsletter down below as well. I don't have to, record and edit these whole videos together to put out an email newsletter. So I'm able to get content and news out to you far quicker, making sure that you're ahead of the rest of the crowd. So the link to join both of those, to save your spot for our free class coming up, is down below in the description, as is the link to join our free email newsletter as well. And of course, you can cancel and unsubscribe anytime, no questions asked.